Hello, everyone. It's Larry Kotlikoff back with Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm delighted to have Sebastian Edwards. Sebastian's an old friend and a close friend. He's the Henry Ford II professor of international economics at the University of California in Los Angeles. From 93 to 96, he was the chief economist for Latin America at the World Bank. He's published 15 books and over 200 scholarly articles. Just 15 books. I don't know, you're a little bit behind me here, but you're a little younger, so I'm going to give you some time. He's the co-director of the National Bureau of Economic Research's Africa Project. So Sebastian's really a global economist. He's really an expert, or my go-to expert on Latin America, but he's also really one of the top experts in the world on Africa, of the economics in Africa. So we'll be getting into a little bit of his knowledge about those two regions, but in general, you can talk to Sebastian about any issue under the sun in economics, and he's going to give you the right answer. He's been an advisor to many governments, financial institutions, multinationals. He's a frequent commentator on CNN and other cable outlets. He's written for the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the Los Angeles Times, El País, which is the top Spanish newspaper, another one called La Vanguardia in Spain, Clarín, which is an Argentine paper, El Mercurio is the top paper in Chile, and other newspapers from around the world. He's been an expert witness in a lot of legal cases in the U.S. and other nations, and he's a frequent speaker at financial and industry meetings. He's also a member of a bunch of corporate and nonprofit boards. So the latest book that he's written out of the 15 is called The Chile Project, the story of the Chicago boys and the downfall of neoliberalism. It's important to note that Sebastian himself is a Chicago boy. He graduated, got a BA at the Universidad Católica in Chile in 1975. He got an MA in economics at the University of Chicago in 1978. And in 1981, he got a PhD in economics in Chicago. But the Chicago boys refers to the Chicago-oriented economists. Not all of them were PhDs from Chicago or professors from Chicago, but Milton Friedman and let's see, I guess several other more senior economists and then younger economists from the University of Chicago went down to help the Pinochet government develop the Chilean economy after the takeover, the coup that occurred, I guess, in 1973, where Allende was disposed. So, just helping a dictator by itself is questionable, highly questionable. And given that we're talking about Pinochet, it's extremely questionable. But so Sebastian's not any part of that. So let me just be clear when I say he's a Chicago boy. He's Chicago trained, but not everybody from Chicago went down to help Pinochet. But we will talk about Sebastian's new book, and I haven't read it yet, but I'm delighted to hear about it, and we'll read it. And he's with us today. He had a little bit of a mole removed from his lip here. That's why he's got a little Band-Aid, but no big deal. Sebastian, welcome. Terrific to have you.
Larry, it's a real honor to be on your podcast and to be able to talk to you about economics and other stuff.
Cool. That's terrific. So why don't we start with you? You're telling people about kind of your background, where you were born in what part of Chile, and how you ended up going to Católica, becoming a major in economics, and then getting into Chicago. It's not an everyday event. When I went to grad school at Harvard, I'm not trying to brag or anything about going to Harvard. Chicago, I think, was ranked higher than Harvard at the time, and arguably still is. But I ran into one person from Chile at Chicago. In my class, there were three of us from the University of Pennsylvania, one from India, one from Iran, one from Ireland, one from Chile. He happened to be named Sebastian Pinera. He's the former president. He's the two-term president. He just passed the baton a few months ago to the current president. So Sebastian and I became really close buddies. And actually, he was my first, we wrote together our first published papers. So we've been close friends ever since. So you can never tell who you'll meet at a place like Harvard, or Chicago. But anyway, getting the point I'm trying to make is that it takes, if you're only going to have one Chilean PhD student from Chile, person has to be quite unique and really pretty darn good. And same thing with the University of Chicago. So to be chosen as a Chilean student at the University of Chicago is quite a feat. Anyway, Sebastian, you talk, I'll stop talking. Tell us about yourself.
Okay, Larry. I was born in Chile in a long time ago, not as long ago as you were, but a long time ago, in 1953. And the South American university system is more like the European continental system. We don't have liberal arts. You go straight into a career, a profession. And I'm not decided when I was in high school whether to go into the law or into economics. And my main interest was really politics, as is your main interest and was your main interest. And at the time, that was 1970, economics seemed to be the key to any political development. So I decided to become an economist, and I was a left-wing activist when I went to college. So my career starts as a left-wing activist. And I went to a national university. That's where most left-wing people went, and we made a lot of noise and demonstration. We had to demonstrate it and so on and so forth. What was really interesting is that as soon as I go to school, President Salvador Allende, who is the first Marxist to be elected to a high office in the world, becomes president. So all of a sudden, we are on the side of the establishment. The president belongs to our side, and we're all leftists. And what we really were looking for was to go out in the street and demonstrate and chant all sorts of slogans against the U.S. and other imperialist forces. 3 years come by, and we can talk about Allende and the very, very bad economic outcome that came about. And then there is the coup on September 11, 1973. And all of us left-wing students are expelled from school. And I was a very good student in spite of being an activist. And I applied to transfer to the Catholic University, which was the private school where all the elite went to. And it was a Chicago-oriented school. All the professors were Chicago grads. And it was a cultural shock for me, going from learning Marxism to learning Chicago-style economics. But I sort of fell in love with it quite rapidly. With the rigor, the methodology, the serious commitment to applied work, to empirical work. And I met Al Harberger, who was the chairman of the Department of Economics at Chicago, a great economist, a superstar in public finance. And when he came to Chile, I became his assistant, an RA. And in 1977, the dictatorship was in power. I was working for a conglomerate as a junior economist, and I got into political trouble. Nothing serious except that I wrote an article that questioned some of the policies. And I was told, you need to leave Chile now. Otherwise, something horrible will happen to you. And I had not applied to school. I was thinking of going to MIT. My interest was in international economics. And I worked on the side as a translator. And I had translated 2 articles by Rudy Dornbusch. And I just fell in love with the work that Rudy was doing, very elegant modeling. I knew that it was related to Bob Mandel's style of economics. So my idea was, I will go to MIT, but a year hence, or maybe 2 years. But then I'm told, you better leave the country or the military will just grab you and send you to prison. And I talked to my boss, who is a Chicago boy, Rolf Luders, and he said, go to Chicago. And I said, but I haven't applied. I haven't taken the GRE. And he said, no problem. And he called Harberger, and he tells Al, remember Sebastian, the kid that helps you when you come around and drives you around and gets you gin and tonics and so on and so on. At that time, Al was still drinking, and we had drinks at the bars. And Al said, yes, I remember. And so Rolf said, well, why would you take him in? He hasn't taken the GRE or anything, but he's in trouble. Would you take him in? And Al Harberger says, well, who's going to pay for tuition? And Luder says, us, the conglomerate, for 1 year. If he's good enough, you'll finance him and fund him from then onward. Otherwise, if he's not good enough, well, too bad for him. He comes back and goes to prison, I guess. And that's the story. So that's how I went to Chicago. And it was a magical time. So Milton had just left, but that meant that Lucas had just arrived. So I take macro from Bob Lucas. I take my first course on monetary economics from Don Patinkin. At the time, Israeli professors spent every other year in the US to get a little money because the salaries in Israel were very low. I got Gary Becker, I got T.W. Schultz, George Stigler, Jim Heckman, and it was magical. I mean, I was there from 77 to 81. And then there are other stories, but let's stop there for now.
Well, that's fantastic. And then you came to UCLA, you went to UCLA at that point, right?
Yes. Well, I had a debt in Chile because Rolf actually, Luders, when he told Harberger, will fund the first year, he lent me the money. I had a loan and I had to pay it back. So I did not, and my father had given the collateral, which was his house at the beach, which had taken him decades to actually buy. He always wanted to have one. And finally, when he was in his middle age, he was able to. And so if I didn't come back to Chile, Rolf Luders would get my father's house. So I didn't apply to go to the market. And one day I get in the elevator, and Sherwin Rosen, who was the placement faculty at that time, I don't know if I can say what I'm going to say here, but it's your podcast. I'll say it and you can censor me. We get just the two of us, and he looks at me and says, Edwards, you are an arrogant son of a bitch. And I'm shocked. And I say, why, Professor Rosen, what's going on? Remember, this is 1980, and there's no internet, nothing. And he said, I've received phone calls from every top school. They've written you several letters asking you for a meeting, for interviews at the meeting, and you don't even answer. So I tell Sherwin, listen, I'm not going to the meetings. I'm going back to Chile because I have to pay this debt. And he said, no, you're not. You're going to the meetings. And he asked me how much I owed, right? And it was, I don't know, $40,000, $50,000. It was a lot of money for me, a lot of money in a poor country. And he said, we'll form a syndicate here, and we will finance it if you get a good job. Otherwise, if you don't get a good offer, then you go back. And so that's why I went to the meetings, and I got good interviews. And then I got an offer from UCLA, where you were at the time a postdoc, I think. And but we didn't overlap. And I told Sherwin, this is the offer that I got. I got other offers, but this was the one that I liked. And he said, by all means, go. And then I did go, but then Rolf Luders forgave my debt, so they didn't have to actually form the syndicate and pay him back. He said, as long as you come back every summer for 2.5 to 3 months, you can do this and stay at UCLA and see how it goes. And I stayed, and I was very lucky. The kind of research I was interested in There was interest in the profession about the emerging markets, the market reforms. A few years later, the Berlin Wall came down. Then the Eastern European countries joined in. They had to learn lessons from Latin America. And I was very fortunate, got a bunch of papers published, got tenure. And Chile then went into a big crisis, a big devaluation. And then at that point exposed, it made a lot of sense that I stayed in the US.
Well, that's an amazing story. Sherwin was quite a character and a fantastic, lovely guy. I have my own stories about Sherwin, but yeah.
No, he took me to the Quadrangle Club. He told me, come back. I mean, between the son of a bitch part and the syndicate, and we went to the Quadrangle and we had I had never had a dry martini before. And I had a dry martini, and I liked it. So I've been having dry martinis since.
I remember giving a talk at Chicago and drinking with Harry Johnson. And
yeah, well, there was a long tradition at the time of a lot of drinking. Harry and Sherwin was but Al Harberger, Bob Mandel. There was a lot of heavy drinking at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it helped any of these guys, but I tried to keep up. I wasn't able. But
well, I learned the hard way that I couldn't keep up with Al Harberger when he was drinking. So Al is much taller than me. He may be 6'2" or maybe 6'2", I think. He's still alive. He's 99 now. So
yeah.
Al was 6'2" and I guess 240 pounds. And I am, I don't know, 5'8", maybe 5'7", and I'm 150 pounds at the time. And I didn't realize, I was a kid, I didn't realize that your weight and your size was related to how much you could handle. So I tried to keep up with Al, and then someone told me, listen, you weigh 1/2 of whatever, 60% of what he weighs, so you cannot drink more than 60% of what he drinks.
Right. So Al, is a fantastic economist. I've been nominating him off and on for the Nobel Prize. I hope he's not, I hope he's doing okay physically, that he could still get it, because I think he's, if you look around at people have made enormous contributions, I think he was tainted us a bit. I don't know whether I have this right, but I think he did try and help the Pinochet regime along with Milton Friedman. And that may be, the kiss of death for getting that award, because the award has some political ramifications. But just if we're talking not about his political involvements or his consulting work, if we're just talking about his pure contribution to economics.
Yeah, he was tainted, but he definitely was tainted by that association with the Pinochet regime. Although one of the points that I make in my new book, the Chicago Boys, this book, is that, and it comes out from an interview that I did with Al, is that he was very different from Milton. He was not a clone of Milton. In fact, by doing the research for this book, Larry, I found in the Friedman archives correspondence between Gary Becker and Milton. And Gary writes to Milton and says, I've been trying to convince Al Harberger to join the Mont Pelerin Society. And he says that he is doubtful, Harberger is doubtful, because he thinks that we are too doctrinaire and ideologues. Could you write to him and tell him that that was the case in the past, but now the society has evolved and there's lots of good people and pragmatic people and serious people? And so we have archival evidence that Harberger did not want to join the MPS, which he did at the end, right? But because he said, well, I'm not like Milton. I am more pragmatic, more centered, that kind of thing. So it's very, very interesting.
Just so everybody knows, Milton here is Milton Friedman.
Yeah.
Because we have a lot of younger, viewers and listeners, and Milton Friedman was, also received the Nobel Prize. He was the most prominent Chicago economist, one of the most prominent economists of the day, what I would say in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. He was on the tube quite a bit. He wrote a book called Free to Choose. He had a series that I think PBS aired, which was talking about the values of capitalism. And he was very persuasive. I mean, fantastic public speaker, and always had a comeback for anybody who was questioning capitalism, but very political, no question about it. I mean, very not political in the sense of favoring like currently we have politicians, people that are like bowing down to Trump, for example. He was never connected to any politician per se, but he was political in favor of capitalism. It went beyond just being an academic and talking about the pros and cons. It was, I am in love with capitalism, and this is the only answer. And of course, it was in response partly to the Soviet Union that he was kind of making the contrast. But since we're on to Chile and these guys, why don't we talk about your book first, and then we'll round things out by talking about South America in general today and where things are, and also Africa. But let's give us a few minutes about the book. Summarize the book for us.
Sure.
Yeah.
So the book is you can look at it from many different perspectives. One way of thinking about it is the transfer of knowledge from the US, from Chicago specifically, to Latin America in terms of economic policy. Now, that transfer starts with the Chile Project, which was sponsored and financed by the State Department, and it's part of Harry Truman's Point 4 strategy. So until Truman became president during his, not when he assumed that was vice president when FDR died, but when he was elected, until that time, foreign aid was not part of US policy. It was, they would aid a country there was a earthquake, but there was no part, it was not part of foreign policy. And then he makes it part of foreign policy. It's the beginning of the Cold War. And T.W. Schultz, another Chicago professor who also got the Nobel Prize, and he was one of the most important, most influential agricultural economists, who ironically was at Chicago, which is an urban university, but that's another story how he got there, right, from Iowa. So T.W. Schultz had been providing technical assistance through the State Department to a number of Latin American countries. And he taught farmers about fertilizers and this and that, and human capital and training other workers and so on. And he realized that he was making no progress because the other policies were awful. Protectionism, overvalued exchange rate, regulation, the price system was not providing signals, and so on and so forth. So he decided that the only way for his specific assistance, which was agricultural economics in very detail, could only work if the country had good overall economists that could understand the big picture. And then he said those should come from local universities in Argentina, Mexico, Peru, and so on. And then he realized that these universities were peopled by economists who were Keynesians or Marxists, or what in Latin America we call structuralists, which is a mixture between those two. And there was no one who really understood the price system and so on. So he found one officer of what became USAID, a guy called Pat Patterson. His first name was Albion, but his nickname was Pat, who was sympathetic with this idea. And Patterson was in Paraguay, but then he was transferred to Chile. So why did Chile become the country? Basically because Pat Patterson, who was pushing from inside the State Department, was posted to Chile. And then so T.W. Schultz goes to Chile in 1955 with 3 of his colleagues. It's a team of 4. And who are the other 3? Al Harberger, who is an assistant professor, Earl Hamilton, the very famous economic historian, and Simon Rothenberg, who is a very good economist. I mean, he's passed, very good economist. His most important work is on the economics of baseball. Okay. Now, Hamilton was an expert on Spain, And he had studied in great detail the Spanish inflation after the discovery of the New World and the great increase in the supply of gold and silver. Harberger had been trained as a Spanish linguist during World War II in case the US invaded or part of the invasion would come through Spain. So they trained a whole bunch of linguists. And Cy Rothenberg had lived as a kid in Puerto Rico. So he just picks these three people who speak Spanish. And they come to Chile and they talk to some, and they sign an agreement with the Catholic University. And the main aspect of the agreement is that the Catholic University makes a commitment to hire 4 graduates as full-time faculty and pay them market salaries. And they start training other economists. And so your friend Sebastian Pinera, who became the president of Chile twice, is one of those who is trained by the Chicago boys from the first group that goes to Chicago. A very interesting anecdote is that when these guys go to Chicago, they take classes from Friedman, from Frank Knight, Metzler, Harry, and so on. They come back and they flunk everyone. Literally, 100% of the class is flunked, because now they teach them modern economics. It stops being a trade school. It becomes a really high quality school. And then the chancellor calls them into their office and says, look, you're flunking the children of the elite. And this elite is supposed to leave to the church their farms and their property. And now they're not going to give the church their property when they die because you're flanking all of them. So you have to allow them, you have to give them passing grades. And they said no. And unless they know how to invert a matrix, 3x3 matrix in no more than, I don't know, so many minutes, we're not going to pass them. And the book is full of those kind of anecdotes, right? Which are very interesting. And at the end, no one pays attention to them. They try to convince people, policymakers, Congress, to adopt some Chicago-related policies, and everyone says, you guys are crazy. Freeing interest rates, crazy. Lowering import tariffs, crazy. Freeing prices, crazy. Reducing subsidies to us because of the private sector, you guys are crazy. And the only opportunity to actually act and to be influential is when the Pinochet takes over and the coup starts. So that's a relationship, that's the original sin, right? And they take over, and there are lots of stories and details, and Friedman comes, meets with Pinochet. That costs him a lot. Everywhere he goes from 75 onward, there are demonstrators accusing him of helping one of the worst dictators in the history of humanity, and so on and so forth. But the Chicago Boys have this original sin. But to make a long story short, the new economic system based on competition, free trade, price signal, no deficit, low inflation, and so on and so forth, produces a miracle. And Chile goes from being country number 9 out of 18 in Latin America, so it's in the middle, to be number 1 by a wide margin. And that's the economic miracle with a very serious original sin, which is the coup and the violation of human rights. So the book tells that story. And then what is amazing is that when democracy comes back in 1990, the people who take over have been, many of them, exiled, put in prison, and tortured by Pinochet. And in spite of that, they maintain the economic policies of the Chicago Boys, and they deepen them, and they go further. And what I couch this into the notion of a war of ideas: Keynesianism, protectionism, structuralism, Marxism versus the free markets. And the greatest sign that you have won a war of ideas is when your opponent adopts your ideas as his own, right? And that's what happens in 1990. And then I decided, Larry, that I was going to accept the term neoliberal for this policy, although it has become sort of an insult of sorts, but it's used so widely that I said, well, I shouldn't ignore it. So I have a long chapter explaining what is neoliberalism, going to the historical origins in 1938 and so on. And then the story goes on and on and on, and it ends with the Chilean paradox, which is the country that has done the best in Latin America suffers in 2018 a great, there is a revolt, and there are demonstrations and a move towards the left, and an attempt to rewrite the constitution. And this real left-wing activist, a 36-year-old Gabriel Boric, is elected president. He's the current president. So it's a history of thought, it's a history of reforms, it's a history of the transfer of ideas from Chicago to Chile, history also of a dictatorship that is very cruel, and the book has been so far very well received.
Wait, well, yeah, I'm dying to read it. I'm sure everybody should should get it. The Chicago Boys by Sebastian Edwards. When you said the current president, he was elected just recently, not 2018.
No, he was elected in 2022. Yeah, he took over in 2021, took over in 2022. So he's been in power for a year and a half now.
Right. So when Sebastian was president for the second time, there were continual demonstrations against him. So I think we should explain to folks that when Pinochet stepped aside, and I guess he was never put in jail or prosecuted from what I gather, but there have been a series of kind of left-leaning and then right-leaning presidents kind of swapping every 4 years.
Well, yes and no. The first 20 years was the left, 20 years of left. Yeah. So there is the first President Patricio Elwin, then President Eduardo Frei, then President Ricardo Lagos, then President Michelle Bachelet. So 4 left-wing presidents. And some of them, as I said, have been put in prison by the dictatorship, and they all deepen the reforms. They stay with the free market reforms, and they were seduced by the success of the Chicagoans. And then comes Sebastian Pinera, right-wing, conservative. Then Michelle Bachelet again, then Pinera again. And now this guy, Gabriel Boric, who is far left.
Right. So I would say that you described them as left wing, but the presidents after Pinochet were relatively moderate because the country. That's my take. And then Sebastian comes in, and he's, we could say he's right wing, but my understanding was that he was also relatively moderate. That if you looked at his policies, they would be viewed as Democratic in the U.S. and he would be like a member of the Democrats, not a member of the Republicans in terms of what he was pushing.
Well,
for.
Yes and no. I mean, the initial conditions, as you know, are important. So when he takes over already, the pension system is individual savings accounts exclusively. So he doesn't reform the system, moving towards that elusive end that many Republicans have been trying to obtain. But the system is like that because the Chicago Boys under Pinochet created that system.
So that was a Harvard boy, Sebastian's brother, Pepe, Jose Pinera, Pepe is his nickname, who actually implemented as labor minister under. He went to Chicago, Harvard.
No, he went to Harvard.
Harvard, got a PhD. I met him at the same time. He was, that I met Sebastian pretty much, but he was went back to help Pinochet and becomes labor minister. And I think in 1981 introduces this pension system, which is, to me, screwed up the way he implemented it. It could have been a perfectly well done system where you invest people in the global market, but the regulation was really oriented towards making the banks rich, not the public, in my view. And I think it's by and large not succeeded, although maybe you have a different view because of the way it was structured, not because of the original.
No, I agree with that. So the idea of having saving accounts which are mandated. So they are not because there's no, and now there is, but at that time there was no government-run minimal social security payment. It was poorly structured for several reasons. First, the rate of saving, the rate of contribution was too low, 10% of salary. At first, because Chile was very poor in terms of the capital stock, the return of those savings was very high. But as the capital stock grew, this is what we teach undergrads, right? Then the rate of return started going down. They allowed to diversify and to invest internationally, but now if you only save 10% and life expectancy is very high, 10% is not going to be enough. One of the big successes or metrics of the success of the Chicago Boys Revolution is that life expectancy went through the roof from 72 years old to 90. When I was growing up in Chile, life expectancy in Chile was like 4 years lower than Argentina. Now it's 4 years higher than Argentina. Right? Now the Argies have not done a very good job at taking care of themselves, but that's a different story. So the OECD rate of contribution to the social security system is on the median and the average is 20%. Chile is 10%. And the other big mistake in the way it was structured is that only people who were formally employed had to contribute, and there's a lot of turnover in the labor market. So on average, or the median is more important. Median number of years of contribution is 20 years rather than 40. So if you have a rate of contribution that is 1/2 of the norm, 10% rather than 20, and you contribute only half of the norm in terms of years, 20 years instead of 40, you're going to get 1/2 times 1/2, a pension that is 25% of the norm.
Plus, there was
that's what happened.
Plus, there were very high fees.
Very high. Well, the fees were very high. Then they went down. The fees issue is a very complicated one, and I think that you've thought a lot about this, Larry. When you start a system from zero, you cannot charge fees on AUM, on assets under management, because the assets are zero. So they started by charging fees that were a percentage of the contribution, of the actual savings, and they would never switched. And they are high. They were very high. They are still quite high. And there's been a lot of, now the system is mature enough. It's about 80% of GDP, which in the US would be today, I don't know, 25 trillion. So it's a big size for it's a small country. But they still charge the fees on the flow.
Right. So it's
rather than on the AUM.
Because if you don't need to have, like, what they set up led to like 20 different competing pension systems doing exactly the same thing, because the regulations were such that if somebody deviated, they had to make up the difference in return. So everybody did the same thing at a very high cost. You could have just had a computer take all the money and invest it the same way, and there wouldn't have been any low fees rather than like 2% of wages or something ridiculous. And, this model caught on that Pepe was pushing in Kazakhstan and in Hungary, in Argentina, in Bolivia. And because the bankers found an opportunity to grab money to charge high fees and have multiple. When I went to Bolivia, I was a consultant. Jeff Sachs took me down to be a consultant in Bolivia. And the president, Sanchez de Lozada Goni, was trying to set up a pension reform like Chile. And he also wanted to have, like, in this small, poor country, all these different competing pension funds, because the bankers were telling him. I said, forget about it, have one, put all the money into one global index and have it held abroad, and give people individual accounts so that they have ownership, and that they can grab that money anywhere in the world, so that no future government can take it away from them. And what happened was that he didn't do that. He ended up choosing two pension funds. Forget the name of it, anyway, in Spanish. But the money was just invested basically in government bonds, not foreign securities. It wasn't individually owned. And then when Morales comes in to take over in a coup, he undoes this, from what I gather. And because people were upset partly about the pension system, but if they had ownership, this coup may never have happened, and Goni might not have been exiled or had forced into exile into the U.S. But he was a tremendous president, from my perspective, a terrific person, is still. We're working at 3 a.m. every time I was down there for like 5 days in a row, at 14,000 feet, and we'll pause, can hardly breathe. 3 a.m, he's still working with me. But anyway, that's tell us a bit about where Chile is today, and then let's talk about South America in general. We may not have time to cover Africa today, but let's.
Yeah, we'll do Africa some other time. Yeah, so Chile is doing, as the French say, comme ci, comme ça, not quite good, but not bad either. It had a very a spike in inflation to 11%. The central bank hiked interest rates very aggressively, and one of the big accomplishments of Latin America in general is that inflation in most countries, with Argentina, Venezuela being the main exception, inflation has disappeared. I mean, it's reasonable. In the old time, inflation in Latin America was 3 digits in lots of countries. This is the first time, Larry, in my professional career where inflation in Brazil is lower than in the US. And they have managed to do that by being extremely aggressive, having an independent central bank in Brazil, which now President Lula wants to get rid of the independence of the central bank, and hiking interest rates with a lot of courage. But I mean, you think about it, that Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, and Bolivia, when you were there was hyperinflation in Bolivia. That was Jeff and the team where you were a member of, were trying to get rid of and to solve that problem. Peru, Colombia, all of these are 3 digits. Colombia less, but 3 digits. Venezuela, 3 digits inflation countries, and now 4%, 5%. It's quite remarkable. Chile is doing okay, but Chile has a lot of future, a very bright future, and at the same time, from the political point of view, some question marks. So where's the future? The future comes from the fact that Chile has the second highest lithium deposits in the world. Another aspect of Chile is that it has it's the best place to locate windmills and generate clean energy. And that is in the southern tip of Patagonia, where the 2 oceans match. They come together, and there's a lot of wind there. There's a lot of water also, sweet water, not non-salted water. So there is the thought, and there's now some foreign direct investment, that green hydrogen will be produced in big amounts. And the third thing is, of course, the northern part of Chile, the desert, is one of the best locations for solar energy. So energy seems to be in the future, and lithium, which is related to batteries. Now, the question is whether these natural resources are used in a reasonable way. The people who are in government now are protectionists, and they believe in adding value to exports. So they want to produce electrical vehicles in Chile, a country with 18 million people, which is very, very far, so it cannot be part of the global supply chain. If you do, in Chile, manufacture one part of an electric vehicle and you send it back to anywhere in the world for the next step, and then it comes back, you ate the whole margin in transportation. Right? This is the country for it. But the left says, no, we have to produce electrical cars. And yes, lots of potential riches, but we have to be reasonable and not fall in the trap that we're going to produce the next. So I asked the minister, right? Do you think that Elon Musk has not built a plant for Tesla in the north of Chile where the lithium is because he's stupid or he doesn't know that there's lithium there, or he did all the calculations and it just doesn't pay, right? Where are the big battery companies plants being? They're in Norway, very close to the VW plants, right? And well, anyway, so that's where Chile is, and the question is, which direction will the economic model take? Protectionism or free market?
What about grids that would take the green energy that's produced under these different sources, wind or solar, and transport it to other parts of Latin America? I know that there was a discussion and there was controversy over power lines being built from Patagonia up to Santiago. Is that still?
That was canceled. The environmentalists won that battle, and now it's not on the books anymore. So the power lines that were going to go from Patagonia to Santiago are not going to be built. So now the hydrogen is going to be liquefied and put into big tankers, or they're going to be pipelines, but mostly what people think now is big tankers that are going to ship them around the world. So that's the idea.
And the wind,
there are other questions. For instance, desalination plants. So the left, of course, and the environmentalists are against anything that has an impact on the environment. So Chile has the #1 copper deposits in the world, but it doesn't have water. It's because of global warming, and copper is in the northern parts close to the desert. So they are building lots of plants that are desalinizing, taking the salt out of the water, but they are using Israeli, not surprisingly, Israeli technology. And the environmentalists say that you cannot send the salt back into the ocean using Israeli technology because the composition of the ocean and the kind of life that is there in the Eastern Mediterranean is very different than the Western Pacific. And so there's clash on everything. Everything you can think of, there's a clash. So it's Chile is now facing this sort of inflection point, and we could the country could go left, or it could go clean and free markets. And in addition to this, there is an attempt to write a new constitution that will replace the Pinochet constitution. So it's very interesting what's going on.
What's the current president? Is he receiving a lot of support, or is he viewed as floundering, or where?
No, he's floundering big time. He was elected with a big majority. He got 56, or in the second round, we have like in France 2 rounds. So the first round he got like 30%, 28%, and then in the second round it was him from the far left against a far right fellow, and he got like 56, 58%. But since he has been losing a lot of support, so right now he doesn't have a lot of leverage, so he has to get in agreement with the center parties, and he's being accused of betraying his far left base. So it's interesting and complicated at the same time.
And do you see the Constitution as ending up, pro, let's say, good economics, or do you think it's going to have any major impact on the economy the way it's written, or is this more about the rule of law and human rights and so forth? And
it's both.
Right to education.
Yeah, it's both. So there was a first attempt at writing a new constitution. That was last year, and it ended up in a referendum, and the draft was rejected. So the far left got 80%, 78% of the vote to form the assembly. So 78% of the members were from the far left, which meant that the right that it didn't matter what the right or the center said. They wrote the constitution that they wanted. and they created a constitution that was very, very, very radical, and it gave autonomy to 11 indigenous First Nations. It changed everything, and it was rejected. They went way too far, although they got a majority when they
Rejected in a referendum by the public.
Yeah, 62% of people voted against that. So now there's a second attempt, and this is going to be much more reasonable, and it's going to support the free market, but at the same time, it will guarantee social rights. So pensions guaranteed by the government, education, high quality education guaranteed by the government. So it's the UN list of social rights that is going to be guaranteed. So, but they added an article, a section to the Constitution that says they are guaranteed, but they will be provided subject to being funded by having enough funding, so the tax system has to, so you cannot run a deficit. So we'll see that there's going to be a referendum in December for this second attempt at the Constitution.
So it might be more of a kind of a constitution of desires, as opposed to with some reality check here that not everything.
Yeah, so constitutional. I in writing this book, and also in writing my previous book on FDR, I've been looking at constitutional law, and many scholars divide the type of constitutions into aspirational constitutions and protective constitutions that protect some gains that have been attained. So the U.S. is a protective constitution; it protects individual rights, and the Chilean new constitution will be an aspirational constitution that will set what country aspire to become, right? And the question is, if you have aspirational constitution, to make sure that first, judges don't make laws, and so the country is not run by a whole bunch of judges. And second, that it doesn't force the government to get into huge deficits to actually provide those social services.
So let's round out the hour here. Give us a quick tour around Latin America. Where do you see things? Starting with Mexico, heading south, because we've done a lot of conversations about Europe and Ukraine, and we'll start talking about China in this podcast. A lot of other topics that are more U.S. oriented, like personal finance, and then things like economic history. We had Roger Lowenstein talk about his recent book about how Lincoln funded the Civil War. Fascinating, how he instituted things that are very similar to today's institutions. But we haven't really looked carefully at other, South America, Latin America, but also Africa. So I'm definitely going to want to have you back to talk about that. But let's have a tour of South America. What's going on?
Yeah, well, Mexico, the president is a tour de force. He's pushing. He is a very interesting fellow, a populist in some ways. At the same time, he is very prudent when it comes to fiscal policy. So he doesn't like deficits. And he's now preparing for his successor, and he has called for a pseudo primary, and there are three people, including the lady who is a woman who is the mayor of Mexico City. She's a scientist who will probably be. She's probably going to be the next president. The country has been growing slowly. There is a lot of hope on nearshoring. Companies moving away from China and setting home in Mexico. I think that it's being overestimated how much it will contribute to Mexico's growth. There are some calculations that say 0.5% per year of higher growth, which is not very high, but I think it's going to be even lower than that. What's been remarkable is that the peso-dollar rate has been very stable. And actually, the peso has strengthened.
What about the drug wars down there? Are they getting worse, better?
I think that they are sort of in a steady state, pretty bad, but not getting notably worse. Although we go, a group of economists, we go every year to Mexico, to one of the state, to state of Sonora, and we've been doing this now for 25 years. And Milton Friedman used to go there, and George Schultz came a couple of times, and Krieger goes there every year, and Deirdre McCloskey. So it's a group of libertarians, pro-market people. Last year, we go during President Day's weekend. Last year was the first time that we got police escorts from the airport to the 5 stars or 7 stars or zillion stars Hacienda Hotel where we stay. So, I mean, we didn't see anything, nothing happened to us, but at least the fact that they provide us 2 trucks with machine guns mounted on the pickup trucks, one in front of our car and one behind it, tells you something. So it's, yeah. So if you go down, and I'm going to skip Central America, although Nicaragua, it's a big problem. El Salvador is interesting because the president adopted Bitcoin as as one of the 2 currencies. The dollar, they don't have a national currency for a while now. So it's dollar and Bitcoin, and the Bitcoin move was a big failure. And the bid-ask spreads are too big, and there are many problems. So that attempt that didn't work. But he has become very famous worldwide because of the way he has handled the crime situation, where he's put every member of gangs in jail, and he's been accused of violating human rights. But he has a rate of approval in El Salvador of about 80%, because now people can send their kids out in the street to play soccer or baseball or whatever it is that they play there, without being afraid that they're going to be killed by some gang member in a drive.
I met him. I actually met him and his wife in his house. I was working with UNICEF on fiscal sustainability and generational accounting in El Salvador. So I met him right before he was elected. And interesting person.
Yeah. So that's interesting. And Nicaragua is a disaster. The Sandinistas are back in the form of Daniel Ortega. A big issue in Central America is remittances. So they get so many remittances that the currency is very strong in all of these countries. It's a Dutch disease type of thing. So the currency becomes so strong that their exports are not very competitive. So, that's a big question. What to do about remittances? So I've been advising the Central Bank of Guatemala on the issue, and they have not, in general, in all of Central America, not accepted that this is a permanent structural change in their economic picture. I mean, the Guatemalan migrants that live in LA are not going to go back to Guatemala, and they will not stop sending money to their mothers. They will get 15% of GDP in the form of remittances every year for the next 25 years, at least one generation, right?
So maybe the answer is to have the stuff invested back abroad in a global index.
That's what I told them, and we explored also diaspora bonds. So to sell bonds to the Guatemalans that live in the U.S. and so So there are. I mean, the big thing is this is the old transfer problem that J.M. Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, and Olin discussed about after World War I. I mean, in order to get a big transfer, something is going to happen to relative prices in order for the transfer to actually take place.
Yeah. So tell us about Brazil, and then Colombia, Venezuela. We can skip over. I think everybody knows.
So Colombia is very interesting. It's elected, as you know, President Gustavo Petro, who is a former guerrilla fighter. So he's a guy who was in the jungle for decades fighting the establishment, far left. He had a cabinet that was quite reasonable, had at least two economists that were highly respected. One, the Secretary of Education, Gaviria, and the other one as Secretary of the Treasury, Jose Antonio Ocampo, who was at Columbia now. He's back at Columbia University in New York. And he fired both of them because he said they are too neoclassical. And to give you a picture, Jose Antonio is a co-author of Joe Stiglitz, and he's to the left of Joe Stiglitz. So they are not really neoliberal in any sense of the word. You really have to stretch the term. But it's moving, the country's moving to the left, he has threatened that if the Congress does not approve his proposals, he's going to call the people to demonstrate and to pressure. Not very good. Peru, Ecuador, it's a mess. It was the only one of two countries that had where the head of state or head of government was not a leftist, but he got into trouble, and now he called snap election, and probably the left is going to win. Now, one of the advantages of Ecuador is that it's dollarized and it doesn't have a currency of its own, and inflation at least is in check for now. If you don't have a currency of your own, you can always bring it back. So that happened in Liberia, for instance, in Africa. So it's great while it lasts and if you behave, but it's so Peru, political upheaval. Every Peruvian president is either in jail or every Peruvian former president has been indicted. And right now, so the last one who was elected was indicted. He was forced to resign, but there's no coup in the technical sense of the word. The constitutional process takes place. So the vice president takes over, and if the vice president leaves, then the head of the lower house of Congress. So the succession is working. And it's remarkable because the economy continues to work more or less doing okay. And the currency is very stable. And they have, for 25 years now, the same central bank governor, who is a great economist, Julio Velarde, he has a PhD from Brown. Very unassuming guy and runs great monetary policy and really 25 years of stable currency. Chile, we've talked a lot about already.
Right.
Bolivia, a big problem. They are selling, they have a stable currency. Bolivia has a fixed exchange rate, 6.86 Bolivianos to the dollar. And when I show the picture to my students of the exchange rate in Bolivia, it actually moves. The students never read the scale, that it moves from 686 to 689 and 684. So yeah, there are spikes because the scale, but no, it's fixed. But it's overvalued and they run out of international reserves. So what they are doing now is selling their monetary reserves in the form of gold. So they're selling gold in the open market. That will probably keep them afloat until the election, and then they're going to devalue the currency, and God knows what happens there. So
and this is still Morales running things?
No. Morales lost the election, and so now is his number 3 guy, maybe number 4 guy. So he decided you're going to run, and he won. But now now that he's in the presidency, of course, he doesn't want to take orders from Morales. So Morales is really pissed, right? I mean, I chose you, and you should be in cahoots with me. The guy said, no, I'm the president now. I am the leader. You go home.
What about Argentina? Where's that?
Argentina, they're going to have elections in the next few weeks. Big mess.
100% inflation, right?
Yeah, inflation is moving towards 150%. Among economists, big discussion is whether to dollarize or not dollarize. Same discussion as in 2021. 2001.
That's what I was pushing Domingo to do back at that time.
So now the question is whether they should do that or no, and it's a big debate, and you don't know. I mean, if you dollarize now, on the basis of the international reserves that the country has, the currency would have to be depreciated by, I don't know, the dollar would have to go up by 500%. But you don't know, because if you dollarize, maybe the billions and billions of dollars that the RGs have abroad will come back into the country, right? And so then you're going to have a lot of dollars, and so that's a big discussion. And the opposition to the Peronists is fragmented, and they are fighting among each other, which means that maybe the Peronists will win, and Argentina will continue to be a basket case, except in the soccer field, where they will probably win the next World Cup as well.
And what about Brazil? Let's stop with Brazil.
Yeah, so Brazil, Lula came back into power. Before him, Bolsonaro, who was sort of a Trump guy, but had a very good economic team, which was led by Paulo Guedes, a Chicago grad, who then became an investment banker, so there are solid foundations. For instance, Petrobras, which was a basket case company, today is a very solid oil company. They sold all their sort of assets that were not related to their core business, and they're doing exploration and refining, and it's a great company. Inflation is very low, as I said, lower than the US, but interest rates are very high. The policy rate is 13%, and inflation is 4%. So real rate, 9%.
Wow.
Okay? So it's wow, right? So if you are an investor, you can bet that they're going to lower the interest rate, so the price of bonds will go up. So fixed income, you can make a little money with that trade. We don't know when they're going to do it, though.
Well, so, well, this is great. This has given us a whole tour of where things are. In general, it looks like South America has moved sideways, or downwards, not necessarily upwards. This is the Chilean hope that things would really continue to grow dramatically. It looks like we've got the same story that we've had for decades in general. Is that a fair statement?
I think that you said it well. It's moving sideways, but the point is that I tried to convince my friends in South America is that they cannot give up, and the battle for ideas should continue, and we should defend our ideas of democracy, free markets, competition, openness, and low inflation.
Well, great, Sebastian. Thank you so much. We've got a real Chicago boy who's not a Chicago boy in the sense of the pejorative version, but somebody who's really contributed to try and make a difference to everybody, poor, rich, middle class, throughout South America, throughout the world. And one of the premier economists. Please read Sebastian's book. Give us the title one more time. Want to show us the book?
It's published by Princeton University Press. The title is The Chile Project. That's related to the State Department project to push free market ideas into South America. And the subtitle is The Story of the Chicago Boys and the Downfall of Neoliberalism.
Cool. All right, Sebastian, thanks again. We'll have you back, talk about Africa. All the best.
Thank you, Larry. It's been an honor to be in your show.